Hi everyone, tonight we'll talk about pregnancy and development. So the first step to pregnancy is fertilization, which is the combination of the sperm and egg to form a zygote. If you look at our diagram here, we have an ovary, and these little circles that are becoming larger and larger are the ova, or the egg. And this diagram is showing you the development of an egg into a mature egg that will eventually be released during ovulation. Ovulation is the time when a mature egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Over here, what you see is an egg and a sperm coming together, and that is fertilization. So we combine a sperm and an egg, and we form a zygote. I'm sure you remember we take a sperm with 23 chromosomes, an egg with 23 chromosomes, and we end up with a zygote that has 46 chromosomes. And that's great, but a zygote is only one cell. So the question we need to answer is, how do we go from one cell to an entire human baby? So let's start to see here what happens. We have our fertilized egg, then we'll notice this zygote seems to be getting bigger. It's traveling down the fallopian tube, traveling until it gets to the wall of the uterus. Here you see the zygote in the wall of the uterus, and that's called implantation. When the blastocyst, that's just the name of the zygote at this point, attaches to the wall of the uterus. If this zygote implants, or the blastocyst implants, it can then hopefully go on to become a nice full-fledged baby. So here is our first step. We start with a fertilized egg, and that egg will undergo mitosis and then become two cells. So the zygote goes from one cell to two cells. Then we do mitosis again. We have 4 cells. Again, 8 cells. And this process continues and continues until you have a nice big solid ball of cells called a morula. And that solid ball of cells will then become hollow inside, at which time it's called a blastula. And then that cell starts to fold in and develop layers, and that's called a gastrula. So again, we start with the zygote. Through mitosis, the zygote becomes a morula, then a blastula, then a gastrula. Then once we get past these stages, we call it an embryo. And then after 8 weeks of pregnancy, we'll call the developing baby a fetus. In our last slide, I spoke about the gastrula. So gastrulation is a process that produces 3 cell layers in the embryo. Those 3 layers are called the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. And these are important because the layer that a cell is in will determine what type of cell it will eventually become. So what happens in gastrulation is that cells start to get their own specific jobs. We can have a more clear understanding of what this means when we look at this picture. So we have a zygote, a blastocyst, a gastrula. And here we have 3 different colors representing 3 different layers. And we see, for example, here, the mesoderm can become cardiac muscle, can become red blood cells. A cell in the ectoderm, however, will not become those cells. It might become a neuron of the brain. It might become part of the epidermis. Something in the endoderm might become a lung cell, a pancreatic cell, a thyroid cell. So what we're seeing here is that the cells are starting to become different from each other. And once a cell ends up in one of the 3 layers, it can only become one of the cells that layer is allowed to become. We have it written out here more clearly. Ectoderm can become the epidermis of skin, the lining of the mouth, the nervous system. The mesoderm can become the skeleton or the muscular system. The endoderm can become the lining of the digestive tract. It can become a part of the lining of the bladder. The important thing here is not to memorize each layer and what happens from each layer, but rather to get an idea and an understanding that once the layers of the embryo start to form, that will determine the type of cell they can become. So this is called differentiation. That's the process whereby cells become specialized, or where they develop different jobs. Once the embryo enters the gastrula stage, cells become different from each other. The question we want to ask is, how is it that cells can be different from each other? when they all have the same DNA. They all came from the same 46 chromosomes. So the answer is that different genes are turned on and off in different cells. So if I'm going to become a blood cell, my genes for blood cells are turned on, and all my other genes are turned off. So this differentiation and all these other processes happen during pregnancy. Here are just two important structures of pregnancy that we should know about. The first one is the placenta. It's a very, very vascular tissue, and it's the connection between the mother and the embryo that acts as the organ of respiration, nourishment, and excretion. And what happens through the placenta is that oxygen and nutrients will diffuse from the mother's blood to the embryo's blood, and carbon dioxide and waste diffuse from the embryo to the mother. So what we're saying here is that the placenta is obviously really important. This is the organ that allows the baby to have food and to get rid of waste. But the way it happens is through diffusion. What's important to remember is that the blood of the mother and the embryo never ever mix during pregnancy. Rather, we have an umbilical cord, which is a cord that is a connection between the developing fetus and the placenta. This cord comes out of the baby's belly button. And what basically happens is that is filled with arteries and veins, and nutrients from the mother and the baby will diffuse across these arteries and veins. Here we have a practice question from a Regent. The major function of the placenta is to. Take a minute to look at your choices. I hope you chose number 2. The function of the placenta is to exchange food, oxygen, and waste between the mother and fetus. It does not store food. Rather, whenever the mother eats, the food can diffuse towards the baby. It doesn't support the egg. It's used during pregnancy. And it also does not cushion the fetus. That would be from the sac of water that the baby is in. Practice question 2. What normally happens immediately after fertilization in sexual reproduction? So when I'm looking at this question, and if you answered it, I would narrow it down to either choice 1 or choice 4. So choice 1 says specialization of cells to form a fetus from an egg. And choice 4 says division of cells resulting in the development of an embryo from a zygote. And I would go with choice 4 because that is the first step. Before cells become specialized, they need to go through mitosis, they need to divide, and our zygote will turn into an embryo. The specialization of cells to form a fetus only occurs after choice 4. So the answer to this question would be choice 4.